It's not every day that life hands you an experience so bizarre, so otherworldly, that it alters the very fabric of your beliefs. My encounter with the spiritual legend of Karim Khan is one such experience, something I'll never forget and something that still haunts my dreams. I'd heard whispers of Karim Khan for years. In my part of the world, his name is spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. They say he was a saint, a man of immense spiritual power, who walked the fine line between the divine and the damned. People revered him for his wisdom, but his story carried a darker undertone, an unexplained mystery that made even the bravest hesitate to speak his name after sunset. It all started when I visited a remote village for work. The village was nestled in the heart of a rugged mountain range, far removed from the chaos of city life. The air was pure, the people kind, but there was something about the place that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a heavy atmosphere seemed to linger, as though the land carried the weight of untold stories. I stayed in a modest guest house owned by an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Anwar. They were warm and hospitable, eager to make me feel at home. Over dinner one night, I mentioned Karim Khan. I didn't expect much of a reaction, but the moment his name left my lips, the room fell silent. Mr. Anwar's face darkened, and Mrs. Anwar clutched the edge of her scarf tightly. "You shouldn't speak of him so casually," Mr. Anwar said, his voice low. "Why not?" I asked, curiosity piqued. "He was no ordinary man," Mrs. Anwar said, her eyes darting to the window as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. "Some say he was a saint, others a sorcerer. But one thing is certain, his spirit is not at rest." According to the Anwars, Karim Khan lived in the village over a century ago. He was known for his piety and his ability to perform miracles, healing the sick, predicting the future, and even communicating with the unseen. People flocked to him from miles around, seeking blessings and guidance. But with great power came great suspicion. Some claimed that Karim Khan's abilities came from a darker source. Rumors spread that he'd made a pact with spirits, trading his soul for supernatural powers. His house, a crumbling structure at the edge of the village, was said to be the site of his rituals. After his death, strange things began happening in the village. People reported hearing whispers near his house, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling an unexplainable sense of dread. The villagers eventually abandoned the house, sealing it off and warning outsiders to stay away. Naturally, I was intrigued. Stories like these have always fascinated me. So, against the Anwar's advice, I decided to visit Karim Khan's house. It wasn't hard to find. Everyone in the village knew where it was, even if they refused to go near it. The house was exactly as I'd imagined, an ancient, decrepit structure cloaked in vines and shadows. The air around it was still, almost unnaturally so. As I approached, I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off as nerves. The wooden door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, faded but still visible. At the center of the room was a large circular mark on the floor, charcoal black and unnervingly perfect. As I explored the house, I felt an odd sensation, as though I was being watched. I turned around, but no one was there. Dismissing it as paranoia, I continued. In one of the smaller rooms, I found an old wooden chest. It was locked, but the lock looked weak. Without thinking, I gave it a firm tug, and the chest creaked open. Inside was a collection of items: an old tattered robe, a pair of wooden prayer beads, and a notebook. The notebook caught my attention immediately. Its leather cover was worn, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes in a language I didn't understand. But one thing was clear: these weren't ordinary notes. The diagrams, symbols, and patterns hinted at something far more complex and arcane. As I flipped through the pages, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I heard a faint whisper, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. "Leave." The whisper sent shivers down my spine. I looked around the room, but it was empty. Grabbing the notebook, I decided it was time to leave. But as I turned to go, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the room stood a figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. My legs felt like lead and I couldn't look away. The figure slowly raised an arm, pointing directly at me. Before I could react, the room seemed to blur. The walls warped and the floor beneath me felt like it was shifting. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. The only word I could make out was, "Why?" I don't know how I managed to move, but instinct kicked in. I bolted out of the house, notebook in hand, and didn't stop running until I reached the Anwar's guest house. They were waiting for me, their faces pale. "You shouldn't have gone there," Mr. Anwar said. "Now you've brought his attention to you." "What do you mean?" I asked, still gasping for breath. "Karim Khan's spirit is tied to that house," Mrs. Anwar explained. "By entering, you've disturbed him, and by taking that notebook—" She trailed off, her expression grave. "What happens now?" I asked, dread settling in my stomach. "Now," Mr. Anwar said, "you pray that he doesn't follow you." Leaving Karim Khan's house wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The moment I set foot outside, the world felt different, darker. The air seemed heavier, as though the very atmosphere was charged with something unseen. I clutched the notebook I'd taken, unsure whether it was a discovery or a curse. That night, I couldn't sleep. The guest house felt colder than usual, and every creak of the wooden floorboards sounded unnaturally loud. Mr. and Mrs. Anwar had retired to their room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the notebook. Something about it drew me in, despite my growing fear. The handwriting was fluid yet chaotic, the symbols intricate and unnerving. The more I stared, the more the patterns seemed to shift, almost as if they were alive. Suddenly, a loud thud broke the silence. It came from the corner of the room. My heart pounded as I turned my head, expecting to see nothing. But there was something, a shadow darker than the rest of the room, lingering just out of reach of the dim lamp's light. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't move, but the air around me felt colder, tighter. Then a voice, a deep guttural whisper, filled the room. "You shouldn't have taken it." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the corner. It was coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. My hands trembled as I gripped the notebook, unsure what to do. The room was silent again, but the sense of being watched hadn't left. I decided to leave the notebook untouched for the rest of the night. The following morning, I told Mr. and Mrs. Anwar what had happened. Their expressions were grave. "You've awakened something," Mr. Anwar said. "The notebook, it was never meant to be touched, let alone taken." "But what does it mean? What's in it?" I asked. Mrs. Anwar shook her head. "No one knows. Karim Khan's writings were always a mystery. Some say they hold the secrets of the spiritual world. Others believe they're curses disguised as knowledge. But one thing is certain, they're dangerous." Despite their warnings, my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't just abandon the notebook, not after everything I'd experienced. So I decided to seek out someone who might be able to decipher it. The Anwars directed me to an elderly man named Farid, a local scholar known for his knowledge of ancient texts and spiritual lore. Farid lived on the outskirts of the village, in a modest hut surrounded by a dense grove of trees. When I showed him the notebook, his eyes widened in shock. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. I explained the story, from entering Karim Khan's house to the events of the previous night. Farid listened intently, his face growing more serious with every word. "This is no ordinary notebook," he said finally. "These are the writings of a man who walked the line between worlds. Karim Khan's power came from his ability to communicate with spirits, but it also came at a cost. These writings, they're not meant for the living." Farid spent hours studying the notebook, muttering under his breath as he traced the symbols with his fingers. Finally, he looked up at me, his expression a mix of fear and awe. "This is a ritual," he said. "A binding ritual. Karim Khan must have used it to control the spirits he communicated with. But it's incomplete. Either he never finished it or someone tore out the final pages." "What happens if it's incomplete?" I asked. Farid hesitated. Without the final pages, the spirits he bound are free to roam. They're likely still tied to his house, but by taking this notebook, you've given them a way out. They're attached to you now. My stomach dropped. What can I do? There's only one way to fix this, Farid said. You must return the notebook to Karim Khan's house and complete the ritual. But be warned, the spirits will not make it easy. Armed with Farid's instructions, I prepared to return to Karim Khan's house. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though an invisible force was trying to pull me back. The villagers watched silently as I passed, their faces pale with fear. When I reached the house, the air was colder than before, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. I stepped inside, clutching the notebook tightly. The room was as I'd left it, but the circular mark on the floor now glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. As I approached, the whispers began again, soft at first, then louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. Following Farid's instructions, I placed the notebook in the center of the circle and began to recite the words he'd taught me. The symbols on the walls seemed to come alive, glowing with an eerie light. As I chanted, the shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming a towering figure at the edge of the circle. It was the same figure I'd seen before, but now it was clearer. Its hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its presence was suffocating. "You dare to command me?" the figure bellowed, its voice shaking the walls. "I just want to set things right," I said, my voice barely audible over the roaring whispers. The figure laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "There is no setting things right. You've opened the door and now it cannot be closed." The ritual reached its climax, and the room began to shake. The figure lunged toward me, but it couldn't cross the boundary of the circle. In that moment, I realized the truth. The ritual wasn't just about binding the spirits, it was about sacrificing something in return. "Choose," the figure said, its voice echoing in my mind. "Your life or your freedom?" I hesitated, unsure what to do. But before I could make a decision, the circle's glow intensified, and the figure let out an ear-piercing scream. When the light faded, the room was silent, and the notebook was gone. But the figure's words still echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that my encounter with Karim Khan was far from over. When the light faded in Karim Khan's house, the silence was deafening. The air felt lifeless, as though the room itself had been drained of energy. My hands trembled as I looked around, realizing the notebook was gone, along with the glowing circle and the terrifying shadowy figure. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. The figure's words, "Your life, or your freedom," still echoed in my mind, an ominous reminder that my ordeal was far from over. Returning to the guest house, I found Mr. and Mrs. Anwar waiting for me. Their expressions were a mixture of relief and fear. "It's done, isn't it?" Mr. Anwar asked cautiously. "I think so," I replied, though my voice lacked conviction. But that night, sleep eluded me once again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure from the ritual, its hollow eyes piercing into my soul. When I finally drifted off, I had a vivid dream, or perhaps a vision. In the dream, I was back in Karim Khan's house. The figure stood in the center of the room, but it wasn't menacing this time. Instead, it looked expectant, as if waiting for something. Around it, faint outlines of other spirits lingered, their faces blank but their presence undeniable. "You think this is over?" the figure said, its voice softer but no less chilling. "The choice remains." I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I sat up, trying to shake the lingering sense of dread. But deep down, I knew the dream was a message. The spirits weren't done with me. The next day, I sought out Farid again, desperate for answers. His face grew pale as I recounted my dream. "The spirits are bound to you now," he said gravely. "The ritual may have stopped them from wreaking havoc, but it didn't sever the connection you created by taking the notebook. They're waiting for you to fulfill the choice." "What choice?" I demanded, frustration boiling over. "I didn't agree to anything." Farid sighed deeply. "The choice was implied when you took the notebook and performed the ritual. Karim Khan's power came from a pact he made with the spirits. By meddling with his legacy, you've inherited that pact. Realizing there was no escaping this, I decided to return to Karim Khan's house one final time. This time, I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for closure. The house was eerily quiet when I entered, the oppressive atmosphere even stronger than before. The circular mark on the floor had returned, glowing faintly, as though it had been waiting for me. I stepped into the circle, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Almost immediately, the shadows began to coalesce, forming not one but several figures. The towering figure from before stood at the forefront, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "You've returned," it said, its voice a low rumble. "I want to end this," I said firmly, though my voice trembled. "You cannot end what you've begun," the figure replied. "But you can choose." The figures around me began to whisper, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of eerie sound. The main figure raised its hand and the room fell silent. "Your life? Or your freedom?" it repeated. "Give yourself to us and we will grant you peace. Or walk away and carry us with you for the rest of your days." My mind raced. If I gave myself to them, what would that mean? Would I die, or would I become like Karim Khan, tethered to the spirits forever? And if I chose freedom, could I live with the constant torment of their presence? I made my choice. "Take me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure seemed to smile, though its expression was more unsettling than comforting. The other spirits began to close in, their forms growing clearer as they moved. As they surrounded me, I felt an overwhelming sense of cold, followed by a strange, weightless sensation. My vision blurred, and the room around me faded into darkness. For a moment, I felt nothing, no fear, no pain, no sense of self. Just an endless void. But then, slowly, I became aware of my surroundings again. I was no longer in Karim Khan's house. Instead, I stood in a vast, featureless expanse, surrounded by the spirits. "You are one of us now," the main figure said. To this day, I can't explain what happened next. I woke up in the guest house as though nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't a dream. Something had changed. I could feel it in my very being. The spirits no longer tormented me, but I could sense their presence, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. I became acutely aware of things I'd never noticed before. The faint whispers in an empty room, the flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I've come to accept my fate. By choosing to give myself to the spirits, I became their keeper, their bridge to the living world. It's a heavy burden, but one I bear willingly, knowing it's the only way to maintain balance. The story of Karim Khan's house remains a mystery to most, a cautionary tale whispered among the villagers. But I know the truth. I've lived it. Some nights I return to the house, drawn by an unexplainable pull. The spirits are always there, waiting, watching. And though I've found a strange kind of peace in my role, I know one thing for certain. The line between our world and theirs is thinner than we think. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.